expansion, to give you a taste of what's coming up with the expansion. Then we'll be going through a presentation, about 15 minutes, where Joe and I will explain some of the features of the expansion, the approach that we've taken with it on this video playing on the screen, to demonstrate some of the points. Okay, so let's start with the trailer. Expansion pack, we are taking the players east to the land of Kitai. And Kitai, much like the other regions of the world, as imagined by Robert E. Howard in his original literature, is based on our own ancient world. Where Sumeria is the Celtic north of Europe, and Aquilonia is inspired by Roman Greco history. Kitai is the Orient, it's the Far East. And what you're seeing in this footage here is the first playfield that the players will have access to in Kitai, called the Gateway to Kitai, which is for players between levels 20 and 40. And we're better to start an adventure in the East than in the shadow of the Great Wall itself. It existed in our ancient world, and it exists in Conan's universe, because with the expansion we very much wanted to give the player a feeling of exploration. The land of Kitai is it's alien and foreign to people from Conan's kingdom. It hasn't really been explored much, and we really wanted to give the player that sense that they're on a voyage of discovery into a strange new land. The player actually starts way off here down in the distance when they first enter, when the Great Wall is off in the distance and they can see it on the horizon. And that's because we wanted to approach the world design in creating Kitai slightly differently than we did with the original game. The playfield regions in Kitai, they're much more open, there's much more explorable game space, more vast open plains and rolling hills, and all with these very important landmarks off the distance so the player can navigate. And so what they find is that the player has much more of a open exploration of these areas to find their own way through the zones and be able to travel through towards these landmarks. So in the case of the Great Wall, for example, you can see it here looming above them as they enter. The playfield regions in Kitai are handled differently than they were in the original game. In the original game, you might go to a travel NPC and he would transport you by carriage, by horse, some hundreds of kilometers into the next area in a different part of the world. With Kitai, while we're still using our zoning technology, everything's stitched together. So you can see here, for example, if you're up on top of the Great Wall, you can actually look out in one direction over the playfield you've just been in and look behind to the playfield you're going to. Because when a player zones through, it'll actually be right where they were. They're moving coherently through, so they get that real sense of progression and discovery as they move through the land of Kitai. And so the next question is why did we choose Kitai? We always look to the original writings of Robert E. Howard as our inspiration for Age of Conan. And Howard, he didn't really actually write that much about Kitai. It's mentioned 3 or 4 times in the course of his stories. But he did express a real interest in exploring that area more in his personal letters to friends. Unfortunately, he passed away before he got the opportunity to do so. And it was the pastiche writers that followed him that really elaborated on the Kitai setting. But we wanted to make sure that we grounded our story and our experience in one of the original Howard stories, so that it really ties into the story of King Conan himself and your loyalty to King Conan and how that all plays out. So, like I said, we looked to one of the original Howard stories, and Joel will tell you a little bit more about what we found.
Yes. So when we started to look into the Age of Conan storyline for the expansion, I went to the story The Tower of the Elephant, which is one of the classic tales written by Robert E. Howard. In that story, Conan is 17 years old. He's a thief living in Zamora, and he climbs the Tower of the Elephant looking to steal some gems. But what he actually finds inside is an alien being called Yag Kosha. Now, Yag Kosha comes from another place called Yag, a planet called Yag, and he came to Earth a millennia ago, well before humans existed. And he's been captured by a sorcerer in this tale, and he's been tortured for 300 years. And when Conan comes, Conan performs an act of mercy, and he kills Yag Kosha. He puts him out of his misery. Unfortunately, before he dies, Yag Kosha has also told Conan that he was worshipped as a god by the people of Kitai. And so when Conan kills him, he removes the protection that Yag Kosha had placed on Kitai. And that has led to grave consequences 25 years later in our expansion pack. Kitai has slowly been spiraling into chaos ever since Conan did that. And as you can see, the people of Kitai aren't too impressed. So here is an effigy of Conan that they've made, and they're about to show Conan what they think of it. On top of that, this is also a very important step in the way that we're telling the story in the expansion, because we want. This is Yak Kosha, by the way. We want to make sure that we tell the story visually, not just through text and not just through dialogue with characters. You actually get to see parts of the story come to life as you roam through the playfields. Another important point that I'd like to highlight is that Conan's actions when he was 17 years old have had a consequence many years in the future. And making choices that have a consequence is actually something that we'd like to try and highlight in the storytelling of the expansion, and Craig will talk more about how we do that.
Yeah. And that's because, as Joel mentioned, Kitai is kind of spiraling into chaos. Howard was always very critical of civilization and society, as he were. He thought that it was civilization's destiny to kind of decay into decadence and then spiral into chaos. And that's very much what's happened in Kitai since the fall of, since Conan killed the god 25 years ago and removed the protection that Yakoshi provided to Kitai. So in each of the 5 playfield regions the players will be able to explore, there are 2 factions in each of these regions, and the player will have to make a choice in factional gameplay of which of these factions that they ally themselves to. And you can see here, for example, this is Joseon province, and there's actually 2 of the factions, they're an outright war in this playfield. And the factions in our world and the world that Howard described, it's not really black and white. There's no good and evil. You won't look at a dialogue choice and go, oh, that's the good choice and that's the evil choice. This is a world of, it's shades of grey and moral ambiguity, and the player will have to make choices on these factions. Some of it is ethnic, it's clan warfare, it's a struggle for power. And the key thing about these choices is it's not just about rewards, while we will have rewards as well. It's about the balance of those choices. When you're making an ally of someone, you're equally making an enemy of someone else. Because the NPCs in the expansion will they'll remember your actions. If you are fighting for a given faction, that faction's enemy is going to become your enemy. So while being loyal to your faction will be opening up new quest lines and new content to you, it'll also be closing some areas off and making it more dangerous for you to go to certain areas because they're protected by your enemy. And so that being the case, we wanted to make sure that in the expansion that each of the factions have a very clear visual identity, and that it's clear to the player who they are. This, for example, is the Brittle Blade faction. And what you're seeing in this sequence is some of the armors that the factions will be wearing. And you'll see that they're visually identifiable in the theme of that faction as they move up through the various tiers of armor. And this time